It's finally time for the top 5 time-themed supervillains. This list will not include villains who are simply from the future, like for example Professor Zoom. Yeah, he travels through time to get to our century, but time isn't his gimmick. He doesn't have a time theme. His gimmick is speed, and also being an evil counterpart to the hero. Similar characters who travel through time but don't use time as their main gimmick will also not appear. Anyway, with that explanation out of the way, let's get started. And of course, as always, these are just my personal opinions and not a definitive list. Feel free to rank your favorite time rogues in the comments. Number 5. The Lord of Time. The Lord of Time, also known as Epoch, is an enemy of the Justice League. The Lord is just like Professor Zoom from the future and uses a time machine of his own invention to travel through time. Unlike Zoom though, time is the Lord's entire gimmick, which is probably obvious considering his name. Anyway, the Lord usually travels back in time to eras of the past, including our own, and uses his superior future tech to subjugate and loot civilizations of old. So his main scheme is to prey on technologically inferior time periods. A pretty cool gimmick. Besides this, the Lord once invented the most advanced supercomputer in existence, planning to use it to freeze all time, and thus truly becoming the Lord of Time. However, he then realized that once frozen, there was no way to restart time, so he was then forced to secretly plot against this super advanced computer and manipulate the Justice League into destroying it, thus saving the universe. That's, by the way, my favorite story with the character. I find the Lord of Time interesting because he doesn't really feel like a comic book supervillain. He feels more like something out of a Flash Gordon serial or a 1950s sci-fi movie. The character very rarely appears any longer, but he actually used to be a big deal. Back in the pre-crisis era, he was one of the League's main foes, right up there with Despero and Dr. Destiny. I suppose you could consider this guy a forgotten villain. That's not a video I'll probably make though, you'll have to settle for this entry. Anyway, a fun character in a retro sci-fi kind of way. Number 4. The Time Commander. So here we have another DC rogue. In fact, I may just as well reveal this now. All the characters on this list are from DC Comics, not a single Marvel villain. Time is, just like ice, another market DC has cornered. Anyway, so the Time Commander, real name John Starr, was originally an enemy of both Batman and Green Lantern, appearing in 2 issues of Brave and the Bold in the 1960s. Both issues featured a Batman-Green Lantern team-up, so you could say he was a villain these 2 heroes shared, which is a pretty novel concept. Back in those days, the Commander was a very basic, by-the-numbers supervillain with a gimmick. A former scientist who became a criminal, John Starr used a special hourglass that could manipulate time. Its main feature was to send objects or people either back or forwards in time, like for example bringing a Tyrannosaurus Rex into modern-day Gotham City, or sending an entire Gotham City street back to the Wild West. There was very little Starr couldn't do with his hourglass. After these 2 appearances though, the character completely disappeared and wasn't brought back until the late 1980s, when Grant Morrison used him in his Animal Man series. The Time Commander already had a really cool gimmick, but this is when he became truly interesting. Morrison portrayed the character as a very kooky guy, but not evil whatsoever. In the Animal Man series, Starr attempts to use his hourglass to make the world a better place. For example, he goes to a graveyard and brings back mourning people's dead loved ones by sending the corpses back in time to when they were alive. He also planned to turn back time to the era of the Garden of Eden, although if he meant that literally is not certain. Just like the Lord of Time, the Time Commander is another time rogue who doesn't really appear much any longer, and could also be classified as forgotten. With this guy, that's a really big shame, as his gimmick was great and Grant Morrison showed the character had a ton of potential. I also like his visual design a lot. The cape and hood is cool and purple and white go really well together. By the way, this was the guy in the lower right corner of my old background. A lot of people mistook him for Our Man, but no, it was the Time Commander. Number 3. Clock King. Clock King is of course the most famous and popular time villain out there, and most people will probably put him as number 1. But that's really all because of his appearances outside comics. A lot of people also mistake him for a Batman villain, because many of these appearances have taken place in Batman media. For example, the 60s Batman TV show, Batman the Animated Series, and the Brave and the Bold cartoon. But in the comics, Clock King has barely ever faced Batman. In fact, he's actually a Green Arrow villain. Clock King, real name William Tuckman, originally appeared in Green Arrow backup tales, published in World's Finest Comics during the pre-crisis era. Now, before making this video, I had never read a single Clock King comic in my life, and only knew him from various Batman media. However, considering these lists are mainly based on the comics, I decided I had to read some of his stories. While doing so, I discovered Tuckman actually had a very compelling backstory. As was established in the 1970s, Tuckman was a poor clock repairman who also cared for his invalid sister. One day he was diagnosed with a terminal illness and was only given 6 months left to live. Tuckman then basically pulled a Heisenberg and broke bad. He decided to become a super criminal and pull off a bunch of heists, getting enough money for his sister to make it without him after he died. Naturally, he chose time as his theme and thus became the Clock King, committing time-themed crimes, like stealing valuable antique clocks. So yeah, Clock King usually doesn't actually have any time gadgets. He's basically just obsessed with time and clocks. Anyway, it then turned out his doctor had made a mistake, and Tuckman wasn't dying. While spending time in prison for his crime sprees, Tuckman's sister was sent to a nursery home where she died. Exactly what Tuckman had feared would happen if he wasn't around. That is a very tragic and compelling backstory, and Tuckman is basically the original Walter White. So you might wonder why I'm putting Clock King on the number 3 spot and not number 1. Well, after its publication, this backstory has mainly been ignored, and in most comics, Clock King is either portrayed as a pathetic loser villain or something entirely different. There's been plenty of radically different takes on the character, and in fact, he's never the same twice. It seems like DC just can't decide what they want this character to be, and frankly, I find him to be a goddamn mess. I don't understand why they couldn't just stick to the 70s version with that fantastic origin. If they had, Clock King might actually have been my number 1. Number 2, the Time Trapper. So once again, a Legion of Superheroes foe naps the number 2 spot. The Time Trapper is arguably the Legion's arch nemesis. He, or it, is definitely the most powerful villain on this list. Out of all these 5, the Trapper is the only one who actually has the power to manipulate time. He doesn't rely on any gadgets. The Trapper is in fact immensely powerful, one of the mightiest beings in the entire DC universe. He's usually depicted as some sort of entity that lives at the end of time, a void space after the universe has basically ceased to exist, and time is no more. The Trapper can control time in any fashion he desires though, and is thus able to peer back into the history of the universe and travel to any part of it. He can also freeze time, speed it up, slow it down, and even create his own separate timelines. Because of his powers, the Trapper is actually responsible for some of the retcons, reboots, and alternate realities in the DC universe, especially the ones concerning the Legion of Superheroes. In some timelines, it was the Trapper himself who traveled back in time and created the Legion in the first place, for his own nefarious ends of course. Because of all this time confusion with the character, his own nature and identity has as a result been retconned a few times. Sometimes he's depicted as pure living entropy, or simply an alien wearing robes, and at one point he was actually one of the Legionnaires themselves, an older cosmic boy from the future. Unlike Clock King though, these changes actually work, because of the very nature of the Trapper's time-altering powers. If this guy simply farts, our entire history is changed somehow. The Time Trapper is just a great character. He's a creepy, mysterious enigma, and I love that look of his. Those purple robes hiding something unknown underneath. You never really know what's under there. Maybe something horrible, or perhaps nothing at all. What I find the most interesting about the Trapper though are his motivations. Everything that he does, he simply does out of boredom. There's not really a whole lot to do at the end of time after all, so the Trapper goes back in time to when stuff actually happened and messes with shit. He obviously chose to primarily screw around with the Legion because they're the most powerful team in the DC universe, and thus the most fun. But as awesome as the Trapper is, there's one I like even more, despite the fact he's nowhere near as powerful, and he is Chronos. David Clinton, aka Chronos the Time Thief, is the arch nemesis of the Atom. That's right, the tiny DC superhero who's not a ripoff of Marvel's Ant-Man. Clinton was obsessed with clocks and time when he was a kid, kinda like the Clock King, and eventually grew up to become a failed criminal. Due to his obsession with time, he blamed his criminal shortcomings on bad timing. Thus, he became the supervillain Chronos, a master at perfectly timed crimes. At first, Chronos simply employed various clock-shaped weapons, like a watch that fired razor-sharp hands. But soon he began to use far more advanced gadgetry, his most famous gizmo being a pocket watch that could temporarily freeze time in a localized area. Eventually, Chronos even invented a time machine, truly aspiring to become the master of time. He's got pretty heavy competition for that title though. So like I said, Chronos is the arch enemy of Ray Palmer, aka the Atom, but he's also DC's go-to time villain. Anytime they need a time-themed rogue to put in a team or pit a hero against, they seem to go with Chronos. He's faced many heroes, including Superman, Batman, The Flash, Blue Beetle, and so on, and he's appeared on most DC villain teams, like the Secret Society of Supervillains, the Injustice League, the Injustice Gang, the Crime Champions, and of course the Suicide Squad. I agree with DC, Chronos is my go-to time villain as well. I've just always really liked this guy. He's got a fun and eccentric personality and perfectly embodies everything about the typical mad scientist supervillain with a gimmick. In a lot of ways, he's the ultimate comic book villain, complete with the most comic booky costume you'll ever see. It's both goofy and cool at the same time. Yeah, what more praise can I really give this guy? Needless to say, he's not only my favorite time villain, but one of my favorite villains, period. So there you have it, my top 5 time fiends. Let me know yours in the comments. And as you may have noticed, we've finally reached 10k subs. So starting with the next video, the celebration begins. So naturally stay tuned for that. And as always, remember, Arkham Asylum awaits you in the next video.